Imagine waking one morning in medieval England. The church bells are ringing, not for Mass, but for yet another funeral. The streets smell of smoke and fear. In every village, in every town, doors hang open to houses where no one lives anymore. You do not know whether tomorrow you will be alive, or whether your name will vanish from the parish rolls like so many others. This is not a tale of kings and battles. It is the story of a kingdom undone by an invisible enemy. The Black Death swept across England like a shadow, killing without mercy, reshaping life, faith, and power in ways no army ever could. Out of this nightmare came a different England, scarred, restless, and forever changed. Tonight, let us step back into the year 1348. Let us walk through silent villages, stand in crowded churches, and listen to the tolling of bells that never stopped. And as we do, we will uncover how the plague did more than kill. It transformed a nation and left a legacy still echoing through English history. The landscape of England before the plague. In the first decades of the 14th century, England stood at the height of a long demographic and economic expansion. Villages clustered across the rolling hills of the countryside, their thatched roofs rising in small knots of smoke against the sky. Fields, carefully divided by hedges and ditches, were dense with wheat, barley, oats, and rye. The land had been worked for generations, each furrow carrying the memory of ancestors who had tilled it by hand and by oxen. From the chalk downs of the south to the fertile valleys of the Midlands, the island seemed full to bursting, alive with the hum of human voices and the rhythm of the seasons. The population had reached close to 5 million, more people than England had ever known before. It was a country of laborers and peasants, bound to the soil, yet deeply tied to a sense of community. In the manor villages, bells rang from parish churches built of gray stone, their towers rising as landmarks above the surrounding farmland. Inside these churches, icons glowed in candlelight, and Latin chants echoed against cold walls. The church was not merely a place of prayer, it was the calendar, the anchor, and the arbiter of daily life. In London, the largest city, perhaps 80,000 people pressed against the banks of the Thames. Wooden bridges crowded with stalls connected the two halves of the city, while boats and barges carried goods upriver and down. Markets spilled into the narrow streets, alive with the cries of fishmongers, butchers, cloth merchants, and sellers of spiced wine. The air was thick with odors, fresh bread from communal ovens, animal dung from the streets, smoke from hearths. It was a city vibrant but perilous, where fire, famine, and disease were constant companions. Yet beyond London, other towns were thriving as well. York in the north, Norwich in the east, Bristol and Exeter in the west. Each was a hub of trade surrounded by fertile hinterlands. English wool, prized across Europe, was exported in bales through these ports to the cloth-making centers of Flanders and Italy. The economy, though still largely agrarian, was bound to continental markets. Merchants traveled roads that wound through forests, across rivers, and into bustling towns, carrying not just goods, but stories, songs, and news from afar. The kingdom itself was politically stable, at least on the surface. Edward III sat on the throne, a monarch who imagined himself as both a chivalric king and a warrior prince. His court dazzled with tournaments, heraldry, and displays of feudal loyalty. The nobility, clad in armor and draped in silks, lived in castles whose walls stood as both fortresses and symbols of power. Knights upheld ideals of service and honor, but they were also landlords, extracting rents and labor from the peasantry. Beneath the spectacle of chivalry lay a hard truth. The vast majority of English men and women lived close to the edge of subsistence. For the peasantry, life revolved around the manor system. Lords held land granted by the crown, tenants worked the fields in exchange for protection and a plot of their own. Many were bound as serfs, tied by custom to provide labor, rents in kind, or small dues. Others were free tenants, negotiating rents in coin rather than service. Each village was a web of obligations and traditions, overseen by the manor court, where disputes over boundaries, debts, or behavior were judged. It was a system old and familiar, accepted as the natural order of the world. Daily life was harsh but predictable. In summer, peasants rose with the sun, scythes flashing as they cut grain. Women worked in the fields, tended gardens, and cared for children, while men drove plows or carted manure. In winter, families huddled together in one-room houses, their floors of beaten earth strewn with straw. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals. The diet was heavy with pottage, bread, ale, and occasionally cheese or eggs. Yet life was punctuated by celebration, saints' days, harvest festivals, May dances, and Christmas feasts. Music, story, and ritual gave joy to the laboring rhythm. The church tower was the axis of this world. It called people to baptism, to marriage, to confession, and finally to burial. Monks in cloisters copied manuscripts and prayed for the souls of all. Pilgrims trudged along roads to Canterbury or Walsingham, seeking relics and miracles. Faith gave meaning to hardship, promising that suffering on earth could be redeemed in heaven. To doubt the church was unthinkable. Its teachings were woven into the fabric of existence. Yet under the surface of prosperity and devotion, fragility lurked. Harvests were vulnerable to weather. A series of bad years could bring famine, as it had in the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when rains rotted crops and thousands starved. Villages were crowded. Sanitation was primitive. Human waste was dumped in ditches or rivers. London butchers slaughtered animals in open streets, blood and offal flowing into the gutters. Rats and fleas were ever present, though no one yet suspected their role in disease. Life expectancy was short. Death by fever, accident, or childbirth was ordinary. Still, there was confidence in continuity. Families believed the world their children inherited would resemble their own. The cycles of seed time and harvest, Lent and Easter, summer fairs, and autumn dews seemed eternal. The Kingdom of England, though locked in intermittent wars with Scotland and France, felt secure in its rhythms. To those who lived then, the social order appeared divinely ordained, as immutable as the rising of the sun. But history rarely announces its turning points. In the late 1340s, that quiet assumption of stability would be shattered. Ships that sailed into English harbors carried more than cloth, grain, or wine. Unseen within their cargoes lay a force that would unmake the world as they knew it. Before the first buboes swelled in the flesh of peasants or lords, before the first bells tolled ceaselessly for the dead, England was a land teeming with life, bound in faith, labor, and ritual. It was this fullness that made the coming emptiness all the more devastating. From the perspective of history, the years just before the Black Death appear bathed in fragile sunlight. The fields were rich, the villages alive, the churches crowded, the markets bustling. But like a stage set before a tragedy, every detail of that world was about to be cast into shadow. The England of full villages, of secure hierarchies, of steady rhythms, was standing unknowingly at the edge of an abyss. And yet, even as England thrived in this fragile prosperity, forces were already moving far beyond its shores, silent, unseen, and destined to shatter the very foundations of that crowded, confident world. Origins and spread of the Black Death. The story of the Black Death did not begin on English soil. Its roots lay far to the east, in the windswept steppes of Central Asia, where merchants, soldiers, and nomadic tribes mingled along the ancient arteries of the Silk Road. There, sometime in the 1330s, a microscopic enemy found its host. A bacterium living in the blood of rodents and carried by the bite of fleas began to move silently along the networks of trade that bound continents together. What began as a local outbreak in remote lands soon became the most feared pandemic in human history. From the caravanserais of Central Asia, the infection followed traders westward, carried in the fur of animals and the bodies of merchants. It appeared in the ports of the Black Sea, where Italian merchant colonies bustled with activity. Genoese and Venetian sailors loaded their ships with grain, wool, spices, and ceramics, unaware that they also carried death in their holds. By 1346, the plague had reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, a Genoese stronghold. There, amidst a siege by Mongol armies, disease broke out in the camp. Chroniclers would later tell a tale, perhaps part legend, perhaps part truth, that the besieging army catapulted the bodies of their dead into the city, unwittingly hurling plague into the defenders' midst. Whether by such macabre means or simply through the flea, the infection passed into the Mediterranean world. From there, The ships became floating coffins. In 1347, vessels from the Black Sea sailed into the harbors of Messina in Sicily, then to Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. Each arrival unleashed a storm of death. Sailors staggered ashore, feverish, their bodies covered with swellings. Within days, towns that had thrived on commerce and culture fell silent. News of the pestilence spread faster than caravans could travel, but the disease always outran the rumor. By the time word reached northern Europe, the plague itself was already knocking at the door. England's fate was sealed by its place in this web of trade. The kingdom's economy depended on wool exports, and its ports were busy with ships from the continent. In the summer of 1348, the first reports came from the south coast, Bristol, Dorset, and the port towns along the Channel. A chronicler in Weymouth described how sailors had brought a sickness so swift and terrible that entire households died within days. The pestilence had crossed the sea. From the harbors, the plague radiated inland along the roads and rivers. It moved with relentless speed, carried not just by rats and fleas, but by human contact in crowded towns and markets. In Dorset and Somerset, entire villages were struck down. By autumn, the plague had reached London. The capital, dense with people and filth, was a perfect breeding ground. No one understood the true cause. Physicians trained in the traditions of Galen and Hippocrates debated endlessly. Some spoke of corrupted air, miasma, released from the earth or carried on foul winds. Others blamed the alignment of planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in a rare conjunction, a heavenly omen of disaster. Priests thundered that God was punishing humanity for its sins, and the people, terrified, flocked to churches and prayer. But whatever the explanation, no ritual, no medicine, no sacrifice could halt what was unfolding. The symptoms were unmistakable. Victims developed swellings or buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck, dark and painful. Fever burned, delirium set in, and many coughed blood, staining their lips crimson before they collapsed. Death could come within 3 days, sometimes in less than one. The sheer swiftness defied comprehension. Families watched as their loved ones fell ill at dawn and were gone before nightfall. As 1349 dawned, the plague raged across the countryside. From London, it spread along the Thames Valley, radiating outward like ripples in water. Town after town reported devastation. In Norwich, chroniclers wrote of bodies stacked in pits because churchyards overflowed. In the Midlands, entire hamlets vanished from the records, their fields left untended, roofs collapsing as weeds grew tall. Even the monasteries, places of prayer and sanctuary, were ravaged. Monks who stayed to tend the sick perished in such numbers that abbeys stood half empty. Everywhere the sound of bells tolled. Funerals followed funerals, until priests themselves were too few to bury the dead. In some parishes, there were no clergy left at all. Corpses were thrown into mass graves, covered hastily with soil. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and silence settled where once there had been laughter, labor, and song. By the spring of 1349, the plague had touched nearly every corner of England. No rank was spared. Lords and peasants, merchants and monks, men, women, and children alike succumbed. The court itself fled London, seeking refuge in the countryside, though even distance could not guarantee safety. The king's household lost servants. Noble families lost heirs. In the villages, entire lineages vanished, names erased in a single season. The scale of death defied imagination. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population perished. Where 5 million had lived, scarcely 3 million remained. In a single year, the kingdom was transformed from crowded abundance to hollowed desolation. Fields lay fallow, flocks wandered untended, and houses stood empty with doors swinging open to the wind. Yet even as the plague burned its way through the land, life had to continue. Survivors tilled fields left vacant. Children inherited the lands of cousins, uncles, and neighbors. The social order trembled, but it did not collapse outright. The Black Death was not just a sickness. It was a fire, consuming lives, but also reshaping the very structure of society. When the worst waves finally subsided in the early 1350s, the kingdom emerged changed. England had stood at the edge of an abyss and peered into it. The world before, the teeming villages, the crowded parishes, the bustling markets, was gone. In its place stood a country haunted by memory, altered by loss, and facing an uncertain future. By the time the plague crossed the channel, rumor had given way to reality. What had begun as whispers from distant ports now revealed its true face within England itself. The nightmare descends. By the time the pestilence had rooted itself in England, the land was no longer a kingdom of bustling villages and crowded marketplaces. It was a landscape of dread. What had once been rumor from distant ports became an undeniable, inescapable reality. The nightmare had arrived, and it unfolded with such speed and fury that even the hardest hearts trembled. In London, the capital that had long pulsed with the cries of merchants and the clang of craftsmen's hammers, silence began to settle like ash after a fire. The streets that had once overflowed with trade now saw carts rattling by, laden with corpses. Parish bells rang without pause, summoning the living to funerals until their sound merged into the rhythm of despair. Chroniclers wrote of parents abandoning their children, of husbands deserting wives for fear that a touch, a kiss, a shared bed might mean certain death. Bonds of kinship and community, long thought unbreakable, were tested to their limits. The plague struck with a swiftness that seemed almost supernatural. A man could rise at dawn to work his fields, healthy and strong, and by nightfall lie groaning in fever, his body covered in swollen lumps that oozed blackened pus. Some lingered for 3 days in agony, others collapsed within hours. The cough of blood, staining lips and staining soil, became a dreaded signal of imminent death. No medicine eased the torment. Physicians applied poultices, lanced the buboes, and prescribed bleeding, but the results were futile. Their robes and masks, their astrological charts and prayers could not hold back the tide. The infection leapt through towns like fire through dry timber. In Bristol, one of the first English cities to be struck, entire neighborhoods were depopulated within weeks. The port, once a gateway of wealth and wool, became a harbor of death. Its ships abandoned, its markets deserted. In Norwich, chroniclers reported that more than half the citizens perished. In smaller villages, the blow was even more devastating. Some communities vanished completely, their names remembered only in crumbling church records and in the overgrown ruins of cottages. Monasteries, those ancient fortresses of prayer, fared no better. The devotion of monks led them to care for the sick, but their compassion cost them dearly. Abbeys across the kingdom lost nearly all their brethren. Scribes who had once filled manuscripts with sacred words died with quills in hand. Cloisters that had echoed with chants became hollow with silence. Even the priests who blessed the dying and buried the dead could not escape. Whole parishes were left without clergy, their bells falling silent for lack of hands to ring them. The psychological terror was as profound as the physical devastation. People whispered of poisoned wells, of curses, of God's wrath unleashed upon mankind. Astrologers claimed that the stars had aligned in malign conjunction. Rumors spread that foreign merchants or religious minorities had brought the plague deliberately. Fear and superstition mixed with grief until reason itself seemed to falter. Flagellant processions, bands of men who whipped themselves through towns crying for God's mercy, appeared in England as they had on the continent, their bloodied backs a living spectacle of desperation. In the countryside, the rhythms of farming collapsed. Fields lay untended because entire families were gone. Crops withered, livestock wandered without masters, and weeds grew tall where wheat had once ripened. Villages that had bustled with the chatter of neighbors now echoed only with the creak of abandoned doors. The very landscape seemed to mourn, its silence a testament to the scale of loss. London, the beating heart of the realm, suffered most of all. Its cramped streets became breeding grounds of infection, its gutters running with filth, its air choked with the smell of smoke and death. Carts piled high with bodies trundled through alleys, driven by men who dared not linger. The pits dug for the dead could not be filled fast enough. Chroniclers speak of trenches where corpses were laid side by side, row upon row, until earth could scarcely cover them. Mothers searched those heaps for children. Fathers sought wives. Many found nothing but the face of despair staring back from lifeless eyes. The court itself could not remain untouched. King Edward III fled with his household, retreating from the capital in hopes of avoiding the contagion. Yet even within the circles of the mighty, the plague claimed its victims. Nobles lost heirs, knights lost squires, queens lost attendants. Death moved with an impartial hand, striking both palace and hovel alike. By 1349, the nightmare was universal. No town, no village, no abbey was safe. Survivors lived with a strange, hollow rhythm. Each day they rose to find neighbors gone. Each week they saw familiar faces disappear. To live was to dwell in the shadow of death, uncertain whether tomorrow would bring survival or the same fate. And yet, amid the terror, some flickers of resilience appeared. Gravediggers, though overwhelmed, continued their grim labor. Priests who survived kept ringing their bells, summoning the faithful to pray for the dead. Families banded together where they could, nursing loved ones despite the risks. Humanity clung stubbornly to its rituals. Candles still burned on altars. Markets reopened when fear ebbed. Children still played in the mud between waves of grief. Still, nothing could disguise the scale of the calamity. Historians believe that in some regions, mortality reached 70%. Imagine a village of 100 souls reduced to 30 within a single season. Imagine fields standing empty, dogs wandering hungry, and parish rolls suddenly blank where names once filled the page. That was the England of 1349, a land hollowed by death, its people reduced to whispers and tears. When the worst months finally eased and the pestilence rolled northward into Scotland and across the sea to Ireland, England was left stunned. The nightmare had come like a storm, sudden, violent, and merciless. The kingdom that had once brimmed with life was now littered with graves, and though survivors would rebuild, nothing could erase the memory of those years when the very air seemed to carry death, when bells tolled ceaselessly, and when hope itself seemed as fragile as a candle flame in the dark. England lay stunned beneath the shadow of death, but even as bodies filled the earth, imaginations filled with explanations, as people searched desperately to make sense of the plague. How people explain the plague. When death moves without reason, the human mind searches desperately for meaning. In England of the mid-14th century, as the Black Death swept away neighbor after neighbor, explanations multiplied like shadows in torchlight. People did not know of bacteria or fleas or the black rats that scurried through grain stores. Instead, they reached for the language of faith, the logic of the stars, and the weight of ancient fears. For the common villager, the plague could be nothing less than the wrath of God. Priests thundered from pulpits that humanity's sins had brought about this punishment: pride, greed, lust, heresy, and neglect of holy duties. Tales spread of cities where taverns and brothels had thrived, now struck silent by divine judgment. Many believed that God had loosed the scourge upon earth to cleanse it, to remind mankind of humility and repentance. In parish churches, congregations fell to their knees, confessing sins in trembling voices, begging the Virgin and the saints for mercy. Processions wound through the streets, candles flickering, chanting voices rising as if sheer devotion could turn aside the hand of death. But others turned their eyes skyward. Astrology was no idle pastime, it was a science of its age. Learned men declared that the heavens had conspired against mankind. They pointed to the rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, insisting that this alignment had corrupted the air with malign influence. Pamphlets and treatises explained that the very firmament had poisoned the world, turning the winds into invisible daggers. Ordinary people repeated these claims with awe, glancing upward at night with fear, wondering if the stars themselves had betrayed them. The theory of miasma, corrupted air, also spread rapidly. Physicians trained in the traditions of Galen believed that foul vapors rose from rotting matter, swamps, or earthquakes, and entered the body through the breath. They advised carrying posies of herbs, burning incense, or wearing pomanders filled with spices to ward off infection. In towns, people lit great bonfires in the streets, hoping the smoke would purify the poisoned air. Some carried flowers pressed to their noses as they walked among the dead, convinced that sweet scents might guard them from corruption. The rhyme, "a pocket full of posies," would echo down centuries as a haunting fragment of these desperate beliefs. Not all explanations were so abstract. Fear demanded a face, and suspicion fell upon the outsider, the stranger, the marginalized. Whispers spread that wells had been poisoned. Foreign merchants, beggars, and especially Jewish communities across Europe became convenient scapegoats. Though in England the Jewish population had been expelled decades earlier under Edward I, the rumors still lingered. Stories from the continent reached English shores of pogroms, of entire communities massacred by neighbors who believed they had summoned the plague. Fear blurred into hatred, and hatred demanded blood. Meanwhile, the educated elite tried to respond with reason, however misguided. The king's own physicians produced treatises on prevention, moderate living, avoidance of excess, purification of the air. Some recommended avoiding bathing, believing water opened the pores to pestilence. Others suggested drinking potions of ground emerald or crushed pearls, luxuries available only to the wealthy. There were even recipes for talismans, inscriptions of sacred words to be worn around the neck. Each prescription revealed more about the desperation of the time than any true cure. Among the common folk, explanations grew more fantastical. Some claimed the earth itself was rebelling, releasing deadly fumes from underground. Others spoke of invisible arrows of fire shot by God's angels into the hearts of sinners. Rumors of strange lights in the sky, of comets blazing, of earthquakes trembling beneath the soil. Each became woven into the tapestry of fear. The plague was not simply a disease. It was a cosmic event, a rupture in the natural order that demanded supernatural reasoning. What united all these beliefs was a sense of helplessness. The true enemy was unseen, unknowable, untouchable. People turned to what they understood best, the rituals of faith, the patterns of the stars, the old fears that had lurked for generations. In towns, flagellant processions appeared, lines of men stripped to the waist, whipping their backs until blood ran down, chanting prayers of repentance. They believed that only through shared suffering could God be appeased. Crowds watched in silence or in tears, hoping that these spectacles of pain might buy mercy for the community. And yet, beneath the noise of sermons and the clamor of rituals, an unsettling doubt began to stir. If the church held the keys to heaven, why did its prayers fail to stop the pestilence? If physicians were wise, why did their remedies fall powerless? Each grave dug in consecrated ground, each body anointed with holy oils, each mass said for the dying seemed to question the certainty of the old order. In that doubt lay a seed of change. Though few could articulate it then, the Black Death fractured trust in institutions long thought unshakable. Faith endured, but it became more personal, more urgent, less certain of the clergy's power. Knowledge endured, but it began to search slowly for causes beyond the stars and the humors. The explanations of the time were desperate, vivid, and often cruel, but they revealed a world struggling to impose order on chaos. The plague had not only invaded bodies, it had invaded imaginations. People looked into the night sky and saw judgment. They smelled the wind and sensed poison. They looked upon strangers and saw enemies. In every explanation, one truth echoed. The world they had known was no longer stable. God, nature, and humanity itself seemed turned against them. Thus, the plague was not only explained, but acted upon. Faith, superstition, and fear turned swiftly into public rituals, private indulgence, and social fracture. Social reactions. The plague did not only claim lives, it reshaped the way people lived, prayed, and feared. Across England, society reeled beneath the weight of disaster, and the responses of its people revealed both desperation and resilience. Each town, each village, each family confronted the terror in its own way, as if trying to hold back a tide that refused to be stopped. In many places, religion became the first and most urgent response. Processions wound through the streets of towns, candles flickering in the dusk, while priests led chants of supplication. Villagers knelt in muddy lanes, heads bowed as banners of saints fluttered in the wind. Children clutched rosaries, women wept openly, men struck their chests with fists, confessing aloud sins they could scarcely name. To the people, such acts were not ritual, but survival. If God's wrath had summoned this pestilence, then only humility, prayer, and sacrifice could banish it. Yet the intensity of devotion often tipped into extremes. Groups of flagellants appeared, Bands of men stripped to the waist, their backs lacerated with whips tipped in iron. They marched through towns in grim procession, chanting hymns, believing that through shared pain they could atone for the sins of mankind. Crowds gathered to watch, some falling to their knees in awe, others horrified by the spectacle of blood. These processions sometimes brought more fear than comfort, a visible reminder that society was unraveling beneath the shadow of death. Superstition too flourished. Fear demanded explanations, and explanations demanded scapegoats. In the countryside, whispers spread that outsiders had poisoned wells or spread powders in marketplaces. Suspicion fell upon traveling merchants, beggars, and strangers. Though England's Jewish population had been expelled half a century earlier, stories drifted across the channel of pogroms in Europe. Whole communities slaughtered in the belief that they had conspired to unleash the plague. In England, the rumors found fertile soil, even if there were no Jewish communities left to target. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor. Suspicion became a second contagion, dividing villages already stricken by loss. Others responded with flight. The wealthy withdrew to country estates, leaving cities behind them. Noble households shuttered their manors, closing gates against both stranger and friend. Merchants fled London for smaller towns, hoping distance would mean safety. But the plague traveled faster than their carts and horses. It arrived in villages where fugitives had sought refuge, a grim reminder that there was no escape. Even isolation proved unreliable. Rats and fleas respected no boundaries, and fate found the fearful as easily as the faithful. At the opposite extreme were those who surrendered to despair and indulgence. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die became not just a phrase but a philosophy. Chroniclers tell of feasts held in the midst of devastation, where survivors drank deeply, sang loudly, and sought comfort in fleeting pleasures. To them, death's nearness was license to abandon restraint. If the end was certain, why not live with abandon until it came? Meanwhile, the structures of daily life strained under the pressure. Guilds lost masters and apprentices. Town councils lost members to the grave. Parish registers filled with deaths faster than births. In villages, law and custom faltered as manorial courts fell silent, their clerks and reeves taken by the pestilence. Who would enforce dues when the Lord himself was gone? Who would plow the domain when all the plowmen were dead? Authority itself seemed to dissolve alongside the bodies of its keepers. And yet, amid the chaos, small acts of humanity shone. Neighbors risked their lives to tend to the sick. Priests who survived gave last rites until exhaustion consumed them. Women nursed not only their families, but the abandoned children of others. Some towns organized charitable brotherhoods to bury the dead with dignity, even as mass graves multiplied. Out of horror emerged solidarity, fragile but real. The contrast was striking. Devotion beside despair, charity beside cruelty, courage beside cowardice. The plague exposed the deepest instincts of society, from its loftiest faith to its darkest fear. It showed how quickly the bonds of community could fracture, but also how stubbornly they could endure. By 1349, the social fabric of England hung in tatters. The plague had forced people into choices they had never imagined, whether to stay or flee, to pray or indulge, to blame or to comfort. And in each choice lay a reflection of humanity itself. Fearful, searching, but never passive. The reactions of the people did not stop the plague, but they shaped the memory of it, etching into history the images of candlelit processions, bloodied flagellants, abandoned villages, and hastily dug graves. What remained constant was the sense that the world itself had changed. The pestilence was not merely a disease. It was a storm that tested every custom, every institution, every bond of trust. In its wake, England would never be the same, for the ways its people had responded, through faith, fear, and defiance, had already begun to shape the society that would emerge from the shadow. From candlelit processions to desperate indulgence, England's responses were many, but at the heart of every village and city rose the church tower, and with it, the question of whether faith could withstand the plague. The role of the church. In the 14th century, the church stood as the great pillar of English life. It was the keeper of time, the guardian of souls, the voice of moral authority. Every stage of existence, birth, marriage, death, was sanctified by its sacraments. To live was to live under its shadow, and to die was to die in its care. When the Black Death descended, the people looked first and foremost to this ancient institution for guidance, protection, and salvation. At the beginning, priests and monks moved bravely among the sick. Parish priests anointed the dying with holy oils, whispered prayers of absolution, and rang the bells for funerals that seemed to come one after another without pause. Monks opened the doors of monasteries to care for the afflicted, offering food, shelter, and prayers. To the faithful, these men of God embodied courage and compassion. Their presence reassured villages that even in the face of divine punishment, the church had not abandoned them. But soon, the pestilence cut deeply into the clergy itself. Priests fell ill in droves, their devotion turning into their doom. In some parishes, every clergyman perished, leaving the dead unshriven, unburied, unblessed. Monasteries that had sung the daily offices for centuries fell silent, their choirs emptied by disease. The very hands that had carried the cross and raised the chalice now lay cold in mass graves. The faithful watched in horror as those closest to God seemed no more protected than the humblest peasant. The shortage of clergy created a crisis unlike any in memory. Bishops scrambled to fill vacancies, ordaining new priests in haste, sometimes without proper training. Men barely schooled in Latin or theology found themselves suddenly responsible for souls. Some were pious and earnest, others sought only the stipends of abandoned parishes. The spiritual quality of the clergy declined sharply, and with it, confidence in the institution. Among the survivors, doubt began to creep in like a draft through a broken window. If the church was truly the mediator between heaven and earth, why had its prayers failed to stop the plague? Why had holy relics and pilgrimages brought no protection? Why had monasteries, centers of devotion and learning, been struck as mercilessly as taverns and marketplaces? Questions whispered in private would one day grow into movements of reform, but in the moment they festered as silent disillusionment. Yet the church was not only weakened, in some ways it grew more powerful. With death all around, people turned desperately to the sacraments. Survivors left offerings at altars, endowed masses for the souls of the departed, and willed land and money to monasteries, hoping to secure prayers for themselves after death. Churches became not just spiritual havens, but repositories of grief and wealth. The institution bled, but it also fed, nourished by the desperation of the faithful. Visually, the age bore witness to new expressions of piety and fear. Artworks of the period began to teem with images of death. The grim figure of the skeleton, the danse macabre, in which rich and poor alike were led by death in a universal procession. Church walls and manuscripts depicted corpses, skulls, and the weighing of souls, a constant reminder that the line between life and death was perilously thin. The culture of devotion became a culture of mourning, shaped by the trauma of the pestilence. Still, the church tried to impose order on chaos. Councils issued decrees about burials, prayers, and fasting. Priests preached repentance, urging people to confess their sins and return to the path of virtue. Some bishops organized public acts of contrition, processions, days of prayer, pilgrimages, believing collective piety might lift the curse. But none of these measures halted the death toll. Each failure chipped away at the aura of divine authority, and yet, for all its failures, the church remained indispensable. Even as trust frayed, people could not imagine life without it. The sacraments still marked the passages of existence, even if hurried and perfunctory. The dead were still committed to consecrated ground, even if buried in trenches. The bells still rang, the candles still burned, the Latin chants still rose into the smoky air. The church endured because no other institution could claim its place in the heart of medieval society. The legacy of this moment was complex. On one hand, the plague revealed the vulnerability of the clergy and the limits of prayer. On the other, it deepened personal devotion as individuals turned inward to their own faith when the collective one faltered. In the centuries to come, seeds planted in this crisis would sprout into reform movements, challenges to ecclesiastical authority, and new ways of imagining the relationship between God and man. But in the years of the Black Death itself, the church's role was both heroic and tragic, both sustaining and disappointing. It marched into the pestilence with faith, it fell alongside the people it served, and it struggled to rise again in the aftermath. To the survivors, the memory of priests dying at the altars and monks vanishing from cloisters lingered as stark reminders that no earthly power, however sacred, could shield them from the hand of fate. The great edifice of the church remained standing after the plague, but it no longer cast the same unshakable shadow. Its bells had rung ceaselessly for the dead, but their echoes carried more doubt than certainty. The faith of England endured, but it was changed. Less trusting, more questioning, more haunted by the silence of heaven during the darkest hours. Thus, as trust in the church wavered, another truth became undeniable. The kingdom itself was shrinking, its very lifeblood drained by the plague's toll. Demographic impact. When the storm of plague at last began to ebb, the kingdom of England looked upon itself and scarcely recognized the face in the mirror. The land remained, the rivers still wound their way through valleys, the churches still raised their spires into the sky, but the people were gone. What had once been a crowded island of 5 million souls now held scarcely 3. Nearly half of England's population had vanished within a handful of years, swept away as if by a scythe wielded by an unseen reaper. The loss was not abstract, it was written in the emptiness of daily life. Whole villages stood silent, doors hanging loose on hinges, hearths long gone cold. Parish rolls recorded names without heirs, lines ending abruptly in the year of pestilence. In the countryside, a traveler might pass through miles of abandoned hamlets, weeds creeping over thatched roofs, churchyards filled, but fields untended. Chroniclers spoke of places where not a dog barked, not a cock crowed, where silence reigned, where once laughter and toil had filled the air. The scale of the demographic collapse was unprecedented. Never before in recorded English history had mortality risen so high, so fast. Some towns lost 1 in 3, others 1 in 2. In certain regions, perhaps as much as 70% of the inhabitants perished. The numbers are estimates, for who was left to count? But the impression left on contemporaries was one of overwhelming annihilation. One chronicler remarked, "So many died that no one was left to bury the dead." The loss of population rippled outward in every direction. Families were torn apart, generations severed, lineages that had endured for centuries ended in a single season. Noble houses lost heirs, peasant families lost parents, children wandered orphaned. The age pyramid of society was broken, young and old alike carried away, leaving gaps that could not be filled for decades. In the manorial villages, the impact was immediate. The web of obligations that had defined medieval life, rents, services, harvest dues, depended on people being alive to fulfill them. With laborers gone, fields lay idle. Grain rotted in barns, sheep grazed untended, oxen stood in stables without masters to drive them. Lords surveyed their estates and found them hollow. Once crowded manors saw half their tenants gone, in some cases 2/3. The very foundation of feudal order trembled for what was wealth without the people to work the land. Urban centers, too, were transformed. London, Norwich, York, all lost huge portions of their inhabitants. Narrow streets, once jammed with apprentices, craftsmen, and merchants, became ghostly. Workshops closed, guilds dwindled, markets thinned. Yet paradoxically, for those who survived, new opportunities opened. Houses, once crowded with families, now stood empty for the taking. Workshops needed new hands. Guilds admitted apprentices more freely. Survivors inherited not only land and tools, but also positions and prospects that had previously been denied them. The Black Death, in hollowing the city, created space for new lives to grow. The demographic collapse reshaped the landscape itself. With fewer people, demand for food dropped. Landlords, unable to find tenants or laborers, converted plowed fields into pastures, easier to maintain with fewer hands. Sheep multiplied, grazing where wheat had once grown. The English economy, already tied to the wool trade, became even more centered on it. Fields that had once echoed with the clatter of harvest sickles now rang with the bleating of flocks. The countryside itself seemed to shift in texture, reflecting the absence of human labor. The psychological impact of emptiness was profound. Survivors walked through their villages and saw not neighbors, but gaps where neighbors had been. Children grew up among ruins, playing in fields that had once been busy lanes. Churches with half their congregation gone felt cavernous, their pews echoing with absence. The demographic loss was not merely a matter of numbers, but of presence, of the daily intimacy of community life shredded and thinned. Even the great institutions of learning were scarred. Universities at Oxford and Cambridge, which had thrived on students from across the realm, saw enrollments plummet. Entire faculties were decimated, their scholars carried off by the pestilence. Monastic scriptoria, once humming with the steady scratch of quills, stood half empty. Knowledge itself seemed endangered, as the human vessels that carried it fell silent in the grave. And yet, amid the devastation, the demographic collapse contained within it the seeds of transformation. With fewer mouths to feed, survivors had access to more resources. Wages for laborers rose sharply as lords competed to hire scarce workers. Women, too, found new opportunities, stepping into roles left vacant by fathers, husbands, and brothers. In towns, widows took over shops. In villages, daughters inherited land. The old order, based on strict hierarchies of labor and obligation, began to bend under the weight of necessity. The clergy, too, bore scars. With so many priests dead, the church struggled to supply enough spiritual leaders for the surviving population. Lay people began to take on greater roles in devotional life, forming confraternities and brotherhoods. Faith itself grew more personal, more inward. The demographic collapse had not only emptied villages, but also shifted the balance of spiritual authority. By the early 1350s, when the worst waves had passed, England stood as a kingdom half empty. The landscape was dotted with abandoned hamlets, their names fading into obscurity. Chroniclers marveled at the abundance left for survivors: meat, bread, ale, land, all more plentiful than before. But they also shuddered at the cost. To live was to walk in a world haunted by absence, where every field, every churchyard, every street bore the imprint of those who had been lost. The demographic impact of the Black Death was not temporary. It was generational. For decades, population growth stagnated, birth rates lagged, mortality remained high, and the memory of loss lingered. England, once a crowded land, became a thinner, quieter one. The social order itself bent beneath the weight of scarcity, preparing the ground for revolts, reforms, and transformations yet to come. In the silence after the storm, the survivors stood upon their emptied land, knew they inhabited a new world. The kingdom had not been conquered by armies, but it had been conquered all the same, by an enemy invisible, relentless, and indiscriminate. The people were fewer, but their world was forever changed. Thus, the demographic collapse was only the beginning. With half the kingdom's people gone, the structures of labor, trade, and wealth began to buckle under the strain. Economic crisis. The demographic collapse did more than empty villages and silence parishes. It tore the fabric of England's economy apart. The medieval system, so long balanced upon the abundance of labor and the certainty of feudal dues, could not withstand the sudden vanishing of nearly half the population. Fields lay idle, workshops stood deserted, and markets faltered. What had been a kingdom of crowded lanes and bustling manors became a land where scarcity and abundance existed side by side. Too few hands, too much land, too many needs unmet. For centuries, the wealth of England had rested on the backs of peasants bound to manors. Serfs owed their lords days of labor on the domain fields, in addition to tending their own plots. This cycle, though often harsh, had endured because there were always enough people to fulfill it. But now, with entire families swept away, the system cracked. Lords found their harvests rotting in the fields, unable to find tenants or laborers to cut them. Carts stood idle in barns, oxen unyoked, plows rusting. Land, once precious, became a burden when no one remained to till it. In response, peasants and laborers who survived discovered their value had risen. Where once they had been numerous and easily replaced, now they were scarce and essential. Men who once worked for a pittance now demanded higher wages. Women, too, entered the labor force more boldly, filling roles left empty by fathers, husbands, and brothers lost to the plague. Markets for labor became chaotic. In village after village, survivors bargained hard with lords who could ill afford to refuse. This new assertiveness unsettled the ruling class. To the nobility and the crown, rising wages threatened not only their profits but also the very order of society. If peasants grew too powerful, what would become of the hierarchy that defined medieval life? In 1351, King Edward III issued the Statute of Laborers, a desperate attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. The law declared that no servant, laborer, or craftsman should accept more pay than they had before the pestilence. Employers were forbidden to offer higher wages, and laborers could be punished for refusing work at the old rates. But laws written on parchment could not undo the reality in the fields. A statute could command, but hunger and necessity argued louder. Peasants ignored the decrees, demanding wages that reflected the scarcity of hands. Many lords, faced with ruined harvests, paid anyway. Others tried to enforce the law, leading to bitter disputes, fines, and resentments that simmered for decades. The Statute of Laborers, rather than restoring order, planted the seeds of rebellion that would one day erupt in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. In towns, the economic disruption was equally severe. Guilds that had once regulated crafts and trades lost members so quickly that apprentices advanced to mastery in half the usual time. Shops changed hands as widows or children inherited, sometimes flourishing in unexpected ways. Yet scarcity also bred inflation. Food prices fluctuated wildly as supply chains collapsed. In some regions, bread became expensive despite the abundance of land because there were too few bakers or millers to process the grain. Shortages of skilled workers, smiths, carpenters, masons, delayed construction repairs and trade. Paradoxically, the very collapse of labor created opportunity for survivors. Families that had once been poor now found themselves in possession of land, tools, or homes left by deceased relatives. Inheritance disputes multiplied, courts struggling to decide who held rightful claim when entire lineages had vanished. Wealth that had been tightly controlled by the upper classes trickled downward, redistributed not by choice but by death. Survivors often spoke of a strange abundance, meat on tables, land for grazing, houses unoccupied. Yet this plenty was haunted by the knowledge of how it had come. The wool trade, long the backbone of English exports, also shifted under the weight of the plague. With fewer peasants to farm grain, many lords converted arable land into pasture. Sheep required fewer hands, and their wool commanded steady demand abroad. Across England, plowed fields were abandoned to grass, their ridges fading into green, while flocks multiplied. The transformation of farmland echoed through the economy, enriching merchants in the wool towns, but displacing peasants who had once grown crops. What was efficient for trade deepened inequality at home. The crown itself suffered. Tax revenues based on the labor and produce of subjects plummeted with the population. Edward III's costly wars in France strained an already weakened treasury. Parliament debated new levies, but collecting them from a diminished and emboldened populace proved difficult. The monarchy, though powerful, was forced into compromises, negotiating more often with the commons to secure support. Economic crisis thus shifted not only fields and workshops, but the very balance of power between crown and people. At the human level, the crisis was lived in daily uncertainties. In villages, lords pressed tenants for dues, but tenants argued that the land was worthless without workers. In towns, masters struggled to replace apprentices, while apprentices used the shortage to their advantage. Bargains struck in haste were broken just as quickly, fueling mistrust. Markets once alive with chatter now rang with accusations and disputes, as coin became both more precious and more contested. And yet, in the cracks of crisis, resilience grew. Survivors adapted, negotiated, and found ways to endure. Some peasants left their ancestral villages altogether, seeking better terms elsewhere. The rigid bonds of serfdom began to loosen as laborers discovered they could walk away and find work for higher pay in another manner. The economic shock, though devastating, set in motion a slow transformation of society, from one of fixed obligation to one of fluid opportunity. The Black Death had not only halved the population, it had shattered the economic balance that had defined medieval England. Scarcity of people became the engine of change. Wages rose, land use shifted, trade adapted, and the very laws of the realm strained to contain the upheaval. The crisis was real, but within it lay the first cracks of a new order, one where peasants could bargain, women could inherit, and survival itself rewrote the rules of wealth and power. Thus, the plague's economic toll spilled over into the social realm, unsettling loyalties, hierarchies, and customs that had once seemed eternal. Social upheaval. The Black Death did not only collapse England's population and fracture its economy, it unsettled the very structure of society itself. What had seemed unshakable, the bonds of lord and peasant, the obedience of subject to king, the fixed hierarchies of medieval order, suddenly appeared fragile. In the aftermath of mass death, the survivors began to test limits, and the old world cracked beneath the weight of their demands. In the manorial villages, peasants who had once bowed to lords with little protest now recognized their value. With half their neighbors gone, their labor became precious. No longer content with customary dues or forced labor, they pressed for wages, lighter burdens, and greater freedom. Some simply refused service, leaving the manor to seek work elsewhere. Others negotiated boldly, knowing lords had little choice but to yield. Serfdom, long, the iron chain of rural life, began to rust and weaken. Though it would not vanish overnight, its decline had begun in earnest. The lords, fearful of losing control, turned to the law. They clung to the statute of laborers, demanding obedience to its commands, punishing those who defied. Manorial courts fined laborers who sought higher wages. Royal officials tried to enforce statutes with penalties, but enforcement was patchwork, resisted in silence, mocked in practice. Peasants, emboldened by necessity, learned that power lay not in parchment decrees, but in the scarcity of their hands. The old relationship of master and serf was inverted. The lords still held land, but the people held the future. This imbalance bred resentment on both sides. Lords cursed the arrogance of their tenants. Tenants cursed the greed of their masters. In taverns and fields, whispers of injustice grew. Why should those who had survived the pestilence continue to labor like beasts, while lords grew fat from wool and rents? Why should the poor bleed for statutes that shackled them to poverty? The plague had swept away not only lives, but illusions of harmony. Beneath the veneer of order, the kingdom simmered with discontent. In towns, the upheaval was just as profound. Guilds, weakened by loss, admitted new members at unusual speed. Sons of humble families rose to masterships their fathers could never have dreamed of. Women, inheriting shops or workshops, kept businesses alive and gained influence in ways previously unthinkable. The strict boundaries of craft and class loosened, reshaped by necessity. Social mobility, once rare, became more possible than ever. For some, the plague was not only a disaster, but a door opening into a new life. But mobility for some meant envy for others. The sight of laborers in finer clothes, of peasants bargaining like merchants, of women commanding respect in markets, stirred unease among the elites. Chroniclers, often clerics or nobles, wrote bitterly of servants dressed like their betters, of maids adorned as though they were ladies. To them, the world seemed turned upside down. What they lamented as disorder, others celebrated as opportunity. The very fabric of English society was being rewoven, thread by thread, by the hands of survivors. Religion, too, bore the marks of upheaval. The authority of the church had faltered, and with it, confidence in clerical leadership. Lay people turned more and more to personal devotion, forming confraternities, praying in the vernacular, and seeking direct relationships with God. The vacuum left by lost priests gave space for new voices, some critical of clerical wealth and corruption. Though the Great Reformation still lay centuries ahead, its distant echoes could already be heard in the murmurs of disillusioned survivors. The growing tension between authority and the common people would erupt most dramatically a generation later. In 1381, long after the plague's first wave, peasants and townsfolk rose in rebellion, marching on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler. They demanded the end of serfdom, fair rents, and justice. Though crushed by royal power, the revolt revealed how deeply the plague had shifted society's foundations. The rebellion spirit, its challenge to hierarchy, its assertion of common rights, was born in the crucible of the Black Death. Daily life reflected the upheaval in smaller ways as well. Fashions changed. Laborers wore brighter, costlier fabrics. Young men swaggered in towns with a confidence born of scarcity's advantage. Language shifted too, as survivors borrowed terms and customs from regions they had moved to in search of work. Villages repopulated by migrants blended accents, traditions, and family lines, weaving a more diverse social tapestry. The plague, by uprooting so many, made England less provincial, more interconnected, reshaped by mobility and necessity. Even the law itself bent under pressure. Courts, overwhelmed with inheritance disputes, struggled to keep pace. Widows claimed rights denied to them before. Children inherited before their time. Distant cousins emerged as unexpected heirs. The redistribution of wealth and land transformed not only family fortunes, but the very logic of society. What had been rigid, titles, tenures, obligations, became fluid, contested, and negotiable. And through it all, a new awareness settled upon survivors. Life was precarious, death swift, and the structures of man fragile. This awareness bred both recklessness and resilience. Some squandered their sudden fortunes, drinking, feasting, and celebrating as if tomorrow might never come. Others saved, invested, and built carefully, determined to make the most of survival's rare gift. Out of this spectrum of response, a new cultural psychology emerged, less bound to old certainties, more attuned to change. By the mid-14th century's close, England was no longer the same kingdom it had been. The pestilence had shaken its foundations, and the aftershocks still reverberated. Villages were freer, towns more fluid, faith more personal, authority more contested. The social upheaval was not a passing storm, but the dawn of a new era. What began as a nightmare of death had become a catalyst of transformation, reshaping the kingdom in ways no king, no pope, no noble had ever intended. The Black Death had revealed the truth. Societies are not eternal. They bend, they break, they change. In England, the plague's devastation gave rise to a new social order, uncertain, unstable, but undeniably different. Out of death had come disruption, and out of disruption would come slowly the seeds of modernity. Thus, the transformation of society found its echo in culture. The pens of poets, the brushes of painters, and the chisels of sculptors turned to death, giving form to a trauma too vast for memory alone to hold. Death in art and literature. When the pestilence receded, it left behind not only graves and ruins, but also images that haunted the imagination of a generation. Art and literature, once filled with saints, kings, and courtly love, became saturated with the figure of death. What words could capture such loss? What brushstrokes could portray a world where half of humanity had been erased? The survivors answered in ink and paint, in rhyme and allegory, weaving death into the very fabric of culture. The most enduring motif was the danse macabre, the dance of death. Painted on church walls, carved into stone, etched into manuscripts, it showed a procession of figures, a skeletal death, or sometimes many, leading men and women of every rank in a grim pageant. Kings and bishops, merchants and peasants, maidens and children, all were bound hand in hand, shuffling toward the grave. The message was stark. Death recognized no station, spared no crown, no crozier, no coin. To the medieval eye, these images were not morbid fantasies, but mirrors of reality, reminders that death had touched every hearth and altar. On the margins of illuminated manuscripts, where once monks had drawn playful animals or decorative vines, skeletons now lurked, grinning from the edges of holy texts. Hourglasses, coffins, and bones appeared beside psalms and prayers. The very books that carried the word of God now carried the echo of mortality. The plague had entered the sacred space of art, insisting that no page be free from remembrance. Literature, too, bore the mark of the Black Death. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, composed in the decades after the pestilence, reflects a society reshaped by loss and longing. His pilgrims, knight, clerk, miller, prioress, embodied the wide spectrum of survivors, bound together on a journey toward spiritual and worldly meaning. Though not directly a tale of the plague, its humor, cynicism, and sharp portraits carry the tone of a world chastened by mortality. Beneath the laughter of Chaucer's storytellers lies the shadow of vanished voices. Other writers struck a more direct note. William Langland's Piers Plowman, composed in the same era, blended social critique with visions of apocalypse. The corruption of priests, the greed of lords, the suffering of peasants, all found sharper expression in a society still raw from catastrophe. The plague gave weight to allegory. To speak of death was no longer symbolic, but a recollection of lived horror. Even popular songs and rhymes reflected the new culture of mortality. Children's rhymes sung in village lanes carried haunting echoes of the pestilence. Lines about flowers, posies, and falling down, innocent on the surface, carried darker resonances to those who remembered herbs against foul air and bodies collapsing in the streets. Memory seeped into the very play of childhood. Church art reflected both fear and hope. In painted altarpieces, the Virgin and saints were depicted more urgently, their faces solemn, their hands extended in intercession. Christ on the cross appeared not only as Savior, but as sufferer, a companion in human agony. The cult of saints associated with healing grew. Relics were sought with new fervor. Yet alongside these images of consolation stood frescoes of the Last Judgment, flames licking upward, demons dragging souls. A reminder that the pestilence was not only earthly, but eternal in its warning. Architecture, too, bore subtle witness. New chapels and chantries were endowed by survivors eager to secure prayers for the dead. Wealthy families funded stained glass windows depicting their patron saints, hoping that light through colored glass would preserve their memory in heaven. The surge of death thus became a surge of artistic patronage, a paradox where grief fueled creativity. The cultural atmosphere was one of heightened contrasts, devotion beside despair, beauty beside terror. Art no longer pretended that life was secure. It stared directly into the skull beneath the skin, into the grave beneath the earth. Yet it also offered ways to endure, to ritualize, to remember, to transform horror into meaning. By the end of the 14th century, England's imagination had been reshaped. The Black Death was no longer only a historical event, but a permanent presence in its cultural memory. To paint a skeleton, to write of a pilgrimage, to sing of flowers falling, all was to keep alive the memory of a time when death had danced in every village lane. Through brush, quill, and chisel, the survivors found a language for their trauma, and in doing so, they ensured that the plague's shadow would never fade entirely. Death had entered their art not as an intruder, but as a companion, a reminder that all stories, no matter how bright, end beneath the same dark veil. From brushstrokes to sermons, from pilgrim songs to painted skeletons, the Black Death wove itself into every medium of expression, and nowhere was its weight more deeply felt than in the realm of faith. Religion and spiritual life. If art and literature captured the shadow of death, religion carried its weight. In the aftermath of the Black Death, faith did not vanish in England. It deepened, twisted, and transformed. The pestilence had struck at the heart of the church, yet it also drove people toward piety with an urgency never before seen. Every survivor bore scars on the body of belief. For many, the plague was proof of divine judgment. Sermons thundered that sin had summoned destruction, pride, greed, lust, neglect of the poor. Survivors filled churches kneeling in penitence, confessing sins as though the world teetered on the brink of apocalypse. In the echoing naves of stone, candles flickered before statues of the Virgin, the saints, and Christ crucified. Tears fell, not only for the dead, but for the fear that one's own soul might be next in line for judgment. And yet, the very church that proclaimed divine wrath had been shaken to its core. Priests had died in staggering numbers. Monasteries stood half empty. Bishops ordained new clergy in haste, sometimes with little training, leaving parishes tended by men who could scarcely read the Latin of the Mass. This erosion of authority bred disillusionment. If the prayers of holy men could not stop the plague, what power did they truly wield? Why had relics failed? Pilgrimages proved useless. Indulgences offered no shield. These questions lingered, whispered in the shadows, gnawing at the foundations of trust. But faith itself did not falter. It shifted inward. Lay people began to take a more active role in spiritual life. Brotherhoods and confraternities sprang up, groups of ordinary men and women dedicated to prayer, charity, and remembrance of the dead. Families endowed masses not only for their kin, but for entire villages, desperate to secure a flood of intercession for souls lost so suddenly. The calendar of saints' days and processions expanded, creating new rhythms of devotion that bound communities together. Personal piety grew in intensity. The image of Christ as suffering Redeemer became central, a mirror for human agony. Devotion to the Virgin Mary deepened, for she was seen as intercessor, a mother who might plead with her Son for mercy upon the afflicted. Mystical writings, emphasizing personal visions of God, found new audiences. Survivors yearned not only for institutional religion, but for an intimate encounter with the divine, something that could reassure them in the silence left by empty pews and vacant cloisters. Pilgrimage also flourished, though transformed by trauma. Roads, once busy with merchants, now bore groups of penitents traveling to Canterbury, Walsingham, and other holy shrines. They came barefoot, in rags, carrying candles or crosses, chanting psalms as they walked. To reach the relics of saints was to touch hope, to believe that heaven might yet hear their cries. Yet even these journeys carried a darker edge, for each pilgrim knew he might not return. Faith was no longer casual but desperate, clung to like driftwood in a sea of grief. At the same time, suspicion and critique grew. Voices began to question the wealth of abbeys, the corruption of priests, the gap between the suffering poor and the gilded monasteries. John Wycliffe, a theologian at Oxford, would soon give sharper shape to this discontent, arguing that Scripture should outweigh church authority, that the clergy's corruption proved their distance from God. Though his movement, the Lollards, would rise later in the century, the soil for it was prepared by the disillusionment sown during the plague years. Religion after the Black Death thus carried two faces, one of fervent devotion, the other of mounting doubt. People prayed harder, gave more, built chantries, and clung to ritual. But they also began to sense that salvation might not rest solely in priests' hands. The relationship between the individual and God grew more direct, more personal. The spiritual imagination of the time was saturated with mortality. Ars moriendi, the art of dying well, became a cultural obsession. Manuals and sermons instructed believers on how to prepare the soul for death. Confession, contrition, faith, and the rejection of earthly vanities. The plague had made death an immediate neighbor, and the faithful were taught to greet it, not with terror, but with readiness. Life was fleeting, but eternity was near. In churches, the bells rang on, muffled sometimes, joyous sometimes, but always with the memory of plague years hanging behind them. Faith endured because it had to. Without it, survivors would have faced a void as vast as the graves around them. The Black Death, for all its devastation, became a crucible of spirit. It exposed the frailty of institutions, but it also revealed the resilience of belief. By the end of the 14th century, England was more pious and more questioning at once. The plague had driven its people closer to God, yet further from blind trust in the church, in the smoke of candles, and the silence of ruined monasteries. A new religious landscape emerged, one haunted by death, sharpened by doubt, and sustained by faith that refused to die. But faith was only part of the story. Beyond altars and pilgrimages, the Black Death had carved itself into the minds of survivors, reshaping not only their prayers, but their very psychology and way of life. Social and psychological change. The Black Death did not only leave England with empty villages, altered landscapes, and a shaken church. It carved into the very psyche of the people, reshaping how they thought about life, death, and their place in the world. Survivors emerged not only with scars on their bodies and losses in their families, but with a new psychology, haunted, hardened, and yet strangely liberated. Above all, there was an acute sense of life's fragility. To live through a season when neighbors collapsed in the streets, when children died before their parents' eyes, when entire households vanished within a week, was to recognize that existence was balanced on the thinnest of threads. Mortality was no longer an abstract idea whispered in sermons. It was a constant companion. The smell of graves, the tolling of bells, the memory of fevered faces, all reminded the living that death could arrive with no warning. This awareness bred both fear and urgency. Some became cautious, clinging to piety and restraint, striving to live sinlessly lest sudden death find them unprepared. Others swung to the opposite extreme, embracing pleasure with reckless abandon. If tomorrow might never come, why not drink deeply, feast heartily, and take joy where it could be found? Chroniclers speak of men and women who donned fine clothes, who laughed louder, who seized love and fortune without hesitation. Carpe diem, seize the day, was not a Renaissance slogan yet, but its spirit was alive in the plague's aftermath. Communities, too, developed a new social psychology. Bonds of trust had frayed during the crisis. Neighbors had abandoned neighbors. Families had deserted the sick in desperation. The memory of betrayal lingered, leaving suspicion in its wake. Yet at the same time, the sheer scale of shared suffering created a strange solidarity. Villages that had buried half their number bound themselves closer in remembrance. Brotherhoods and guilds multiplied, not only for economic support, but for mutual prayer, comfort, and the promise that no one would be left unburied again. The plague also shifted attitudes toward wealth and status. Survivors inherited lands, tools, and homes once thought beyond their reach. The sight of peasants wearing their lord's old garments or women running businesses in towns became familiar. This upward movement was not only economic but psychological. People no longer saw themselves entirely trapped in the roles of birth. Fate, so arbitrary in death, seemed to whisper that destiny in life could also be reshaped. A subtle sense of individual worth, of personal possibility, began to stir. For children growing up in the decades after, the psychological imprint was profound. They played in abandoned cottages, told stories of ghosts and spirits haunting ruined villages, and grew into adults who had known famine and death from their earliest memories. Their worldview was shaped by impermanence. To them, the old certainties of endless population and stable custom seemed illusions. They carried forward a culture more skeptical, more hardened, yet also more inventive in finding meaning. Literature and preaching reflected this mental shift. Sermons dwelt on the brevity of life, urging listeners to prepare their souls at every moment. Morality plays performed in towns dramatized the battle between virtue and vice, reminding audiences that death came for all. In verse and song, themes of fleeting joy, of beauty cut short, of the grave's inevitability spread widely. The culture itself became more self-aware of time, of endings, of the need to make sense of suffering. Even humor bore the stamp of change. Gallows humor, dark jokes about death and decay, became a part of everyday speech. To laugh at death was to take back a fragment of power from it, to survive not only in body, but in spirit. In taverns, men mocked their own frailty. In markets, women joked about fortune's fickleness. Such laughter was brittle, but it was also a form of resilience. Underlying all these shifts was a new relationship with death itself. Before the plague, death was expected but often distant, coming in old age or through war. Afterward, it was immediate, familiar, stripped of illusion. This closeness altered psychology. People spoke more openly of the end, prepared wills with greater care, and funded chantries to secure prayers. The art of dying well, ars moriendi, became not a scholarly exercise but a daily meditation. The social psyche of England was thus forever marked. Survivors walked through a world that felt both emptier and fuller, emptier of those they had loved, fuller of opportunities reshaped by absence. They carried grief like a constant weight, but they also carried a sharper sense of life's urgency. The plague had stripped away illusions of permanence. What remained was raw humanity, forced to look death in the face and learn to live differently because of it. By the close of the 14th century, England was not only demographically smaller and economically altered, it was psychologically transformed. Its people were more cautious, yet more daring, more pious, yet more questioning, more fearful, yet more resilient. The Black Death had taught them a truth that could not be forgotten, that life was fleeting, that death was certain, and that the meaning of existence must be sought in the fragile, burning light of the present moment. Yet these shifts in thought and behavior did not remain confined to the mind or spirit. They spilled into the fields, markets, and manners, reshaping the very economy and society of England. Economy and society. The Black Death did not end with the graves it filled. It remade the living world that remained. In the decades after the pestilence, England's economy and society entered a strange new balance. It was a kingdom thinned of people yet thick with opportunities, a land where scarcity and abundance collided, where the rules of the past were bent to accommodate the realities of survival. At first glance, the countryside looked desolate. Abandoned villages dotted the landscape, their thatched roofs collapsed, their fields gone to wild grass. Yet, in these empty spaces lay opportunity. Survivors inherited not only the land of their parents, but also that of uncles, cousins, and neighbors who had left no heirs. A peasant who once held a single narrow strip of soil might suddenly find himself master of broad acres. For the first time in memory, the balance between land and labor tilted in favor of the commoner. Wages reflected this shift. Before the plague, laborers were many, and their bargaining power weak. After, with hands scarce, they commanded higher pay. Shepherds, plowmen, and reapers found themselves courted by lords eager to secure their services. In towns, carpenters, masons, and smiths could charge sums previously reserved for the elite of their craft. For the lower classes, survival had brought a strange reward. Their labor was now precious, and their voices carried weight in ways they never had before. The ruling elite, however, did not welcome this new reality. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, had attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but it proved impossible to enforce. Laborers ignored it. Lords, desperate for workers, quietly paid more. The law lingered on parchment, a symbol of authority, but in practice, it was a battlefield where the old order clashed with the new. Each refusal to obey, each clandestine bargain chipped away at the feudal bonds that had tied peasants to their lords for centuries. Meanwhile, patterns of land use transformed. With fewer mouths to feed and fewer hands to farm, lords abandoned labor-intensive grain cultivation and turned to sheep. Wool, already England's most profitable export, became even more central to the economy. Across the Midlands and the South, arable fields gave way to wide pastures dotted with flocks. The countryside itself changed in appearance. Ridged furrows faded beneath grass, hedges enclosed new grazing grounds, and the bleating of sheep replaced the clatter of sickles at harvest time. Merchants in towns like Lincoln and London grew rich on the wool trade, even as the peasants who once plowed those fields found their way of life slipping away. In urban centers, the changes were no less striking. Guilds, their ranks thinned by plague, admitted new members more freely. Apprentices advanced quickly to journeymen, journeymen to masters. Widows took over workshops, daughters inherited businesses, families previously excluded from prosperity found new doors open. The rigid hierarchies of craft and trade loosened, reshaped by necessity. For some, the plague had been a catastrophe. For others, it was the unlikely key to advancement. Wealth, too, was redistributed. The deaths of so many meant inheritances multiplied. Families that survived intact gained lands, houses, and goods at a pace unthinkable before. But this abundance was uneven. Some peasants rose to new prosperity, while others, displaced by enclosure or unable to secure work, wandered as vagrants across the countryside. Poverty did not disappear. It shifted, reshaped by the forces of demographic collapse and economic adaptation. The crown and nobility struggled to adjust. Tax revenues had plunged with the loss of population, even as the costs of war with France drained the treasury. Edward III and his successors sought new levies, but resistance was strong. The Commons in Parliament, emboldened by the new importance of the common man, pressed for greater influence. Out of necessity, the monarchy began to negotiate more openly with representatives beyond the nobility, laying quiet foundations for the political shifts of the later Middle Ages. Amid these structural changes, daily life bore the marks of transformation. Markets were quieter but more varied, filled with goods from abandoned estates. Alehouses, once packed with farmers and craftsmen, now saw new faces: landless laborers seeking work, widows bartering for supplies, merchants boasting of wool profits. Social mingling grew more fluid. The son of a peasant might drink alongside a craftsman or a minor landowner, all bound together by the shared reality of a world forever altered. Yet opportunity was shadowed by tension. The lords saw their power slipping, the laborers their leverage growing. Statutes, fines, and punishments attempted to restore the old balance, but resistance simmered. In the fields, peasants muttered about injustice. In the taverns, they spoke of freedom. The seeds of open revolt were planted, watered by resentment at laws that tried to chain them back to a world already gone. At the same time, society became more mobile. Survivors moved from village to village, town to town, seeking better wages and lighter burdens. Whole communities reshuffled, mingling dialects and customs. England grew less insular, more fluid, its people shaped by the experience of movement and change. The plague had uprooted them, and they no longer accepted roots as destiny. By the end of the 14th century, England was a kingdom transformed. Its villages were smaller, its fields more pastoral, its towns more open, its laborers more assertive. Feudalism, once the unchallenged order, staggered beneath the pressure of new realities. A society that had been rigid, stratified, and predictable was now dynamic, unstable, and charged with possibility. The Black Death had devastated England, but in its aftermath, it had also forced the kingdom into a painful rebirth. Out of ruin came redistribution, out of scarcity came bargaining power, out of loss came new beginnings. The economy bore scars, but it also carried the marks of renewal. Society groaned beneath tension, but it also pulsed with new life. The plague had taught England a harsh lesson. Survival itself could be transformative. In the emptied spaces of its villages and the altered rhythms of its markets, a new England was taking shape, one less bound by the old chains of serfdom, more open to change, and forever marked by the memory of a time when death had been everywhere, and yet life had found a way forward. And yet, the transformations born of survival did not stop at markets and manors. They climbed into the halls of power, unsettling the crown, the nobility, and the very structure of English politics. Political consequences. The plague did not simply unmake England's villages and unsettle its economy. It altered the relationship between rulers and ruled. Politics in the decades after the Black Death bore the marks of strain and transformation, as monarchy, nobility, and commons grappled with the consequences of a half-empty kingdom. Death had struck without discrimination, but in its wake, the old order was forced to reckon with new realities. At the Crown, the devastation was most visible in revenue. Taxes that had once flowed steadily into the royal treasury dwindled as the population shrank. Edward III, already entangled in the costly campaigns of the 100 Years' War, faced the bitter irony of ruling over a kingdom richer in land, but poorer in people. With fewer tenants and fewer merchants, the base of taxation crumbled. The king's demands for subsidies grew sharper, and Parliament became a stage upon which new tensions played out. The Commons, representing townsmen and lesser landowners, began to realize their power. They held the purse strings in a way they never had before. Each request for funds gave them leverage, and they pressed for redress of grievances in return. This shift, subtle at first, marked a long-term rebalancing of English governance. The plague had not created Parliament, but it strengthened its hand, giving voice to those outside the circle of nobility. A kingdom that had once been ruled from the throne and the baronial hall was now tilting toward broader participation, however limited. The nobility, too, was shaken. Death had thinned their ranks, leaving estates without heirs, titles without successors, and castles with hollow halls. Inheritance crises multiplied, with distant cousins claiming lands once firmly secured. Some families flourished, consolidating their holdings by marrying into widowed estates. Others declined, their fortunes shattered by sudden extinction. The hierarchy of lordship, once a fortress of continuity, seemed vulnerable. A noble lineage, no matter how ancient, could vanish in a single season of plague. In the countryside, the struggle over labor grew political. Lords pressed Parliament for stricter enforcement of the Statute of Laborers, hoping the law would bind peasants back to pre-plague obligations. Yet each attempt revealed the weakness of authority when confronted by reality. The statute bred resentment, and resentment bred defiance. The gap between legislation and lived experience widened, eroding respect for the state itself. To many peasants, the government appeared not as protector, but as enforcer of injustice, an arm of the Lord's will. This tension reached its crescendo in 1381 during the Peasants' Revolt. Though decades after the first wave of plague, the rebellion was the child of its aftermath. Economic strain, the weight of poll taxes, and anger at labor statutes exploded into open defiance. Thousands of peasants, artisans, and townsfolk marched under the banner of justice, led by Wat Tyler and inflamed by the words of radical preachers like John Ball. They surged toward London, demanding an end to serfdom, fair rents, and freedom from feudal dues. The revolt shocked the kingdom. For the first time in memory, commoners dared not only to resist, but to confront the monarchy itself. They stormed London, burning manorial records, executing officials, and forcing the young King Richard II into negotiation. Though the uprising was ultimately suppressed with violence, its echoes rang long afterward. It revealed that the social order, already destabilized by plague, could no longer rely on unquestioned obedience. Authority would forever carry the memory of that summer when the people rose. The church, a political as well as spiritual power, also bore scars. Its immense losses in clergy and its visible failure to protect the faithful weakened its political authority. Dissenting voices like those of Wycliffe and the Lollards found fertile ground. They questioned not only theology but also the church's worldly power, its lands, its wealth, its role in government. Though the Lollard movement would be crushed, the fissures remained, foreshadowing later upheavals that would reshape both church and crown. Even within the monarchy, the plague's shadow lingered. Edward III's long reign ended in decline, his resources drained, his court riddled with faction. His successors inherited not only the war abroad, but also a kingdom restless at home. The reduced population meant a narrower pool of loyal knights and officials. The crown relied increasingly on taxation and consent, rather than sheer manpower to sustain itself. The political compact of the kingdom was shifting from a feudal order of service to a negotiated order of survival. For the common people, politics became less distant. The memory of mass death, the experience of bargaining for wages, the sight of revolt in their own lifetimes, all combined to foster a sense of agency. While they did not yet possess full political rights, they had glimpsed their collective strength. The old fear of lords and sheriffs, of statutes and decrees, was tempered by the knowledge that survival itself gave them leverage. The plague also left its imprint on law. Inheritance cases swelled the courts, redefining property rights. Widows claimed dowries. Orphans contested guardianship. Distant kin emerged to press claims. Judges and clerks struggled to adapt, and in doing so, the law became more flexible, more attuned to a society in flux. Political power, once tightly bound to lineage, now shifted more freely with the tides of death and survival. By the close of the 14th century, England's political landscape bore little resemblance to that of 1340. Parliament had grown in influence, the nobility had been shaken, the monarchy weakened, and the commons emboldened. Authority remained, but it was more contested, more negotiated, more fragile. The Black Death had not toppled the state, but it had cracked its foundation. From those cracks, new shoots of change began to grow. In the grand sweep of history, the plague was not only a demographic or economic disaster, it was a political turning point. It forced monarchy and parliament into uneasy partnership, eroded the feudal bonds of lord and peasant, and gave birth to the first great popular rebellion in English history. The bells that had tolled for the dead in 1349 echoed decades later in the cries of rebels outside London's walls. The Black Death had shown that power, like life itself, was fragile. Kings could not command death, lords could not compel obedience, priests could not shield their flocks. In the silence after the pestilence, a new truth rang clear. Politics, like the body, could be remade by catastrophe. England would endure, but it would never again be the same kingdom it had been before the plague. Yet the tremors of the Black Death did not stop at throne or parliament. They reached deeper still, unsettling the faith of the people and reshaping the very ways in which England thought, prayed, and imagined the world. Religion and intellectual life. The Black Death did more than hollow England's villages and stir rebellion in its fields. It unsettled the very soul of the kingdom, the faith that bound heaven to earth, and the thought that gave order to the world. Out of the silence of empty monasteries and the doubt whispered in parish pews, a new religious and intellectual landscape began to take shape. When the pestilence raged, the church had been the first refuge. Priests blessed the dying, monks prayed for the sick, bishops called for processions of repentance. Yet the plague cut them down as mercilessly as their flocks. Entire parishes were left without clergy. Monasteries lost half their brothers. Universities saw professors vanish overnight. The faithful, who had expected protection, instead saw the weakness of those who claimed to hold the keys of heaven. Faith endured, but it was bruised. That bruise gave rise to new forms of devotion. Lay people, unable to rely on priests, began to take faith into their own hands. Confraternities of prayer and charity multiplied. Groups of townsfolk and villagers who promised to care for the sick, to bury the dead, to fund masses for souls in purgatory. Religion became less a hierarchy imposed from above and more a web of communities knitting themselves together. In the glow of candles lit by common hands, a new spirituality flourished. Mysticism, too, found fertile ground. In the decades after the plague, English spiritual writers such as Julian of Norwich and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing gave voice to a faith more personal, more inward, less dependent on external ritual. Julian, who lived through the plague years, spoke of visions where even suffering was enfolded in God's love. Her famous words, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," resonated with a society desperate to find meaning in devastation. In the shadow of mass death, mysticism offered intimacy with the divine when institutions seemed to falter. At the same time, critics of the church grew bolder. John Wycliffe, an Oxford scholar, gave voice to discontent that had been simmering since the pestilence. He argued that Scripture, not the church, should be the foundation of faith. He condemned clerical wealth, questioned the doctrine of transubstantiation, and declared that laypeople should have access to the Bible in their own tongue. The trauma of the plague had weakened trust in priests' intercession, and Wycliffe's words struck deep chords. His followers, known as Lollards, carried his teachings into towns and villages, spreading ideas that would later echo in the Reformation. The intellectual impact of the plague extended beyond theology. In universities, the sudden death of so many scholars disrupted the continuity of traditional learning. Students advanced quickly to fill vacancies, bringing fresh energy, but also diluting the rigor of training. Scholasticism, the grand system that had sought to explain the world through logic and the writings of Aristotle, suffered under the weight of reality it could not explain. What use were elaborate disputations when the world itself seemed ruled by chaos? Some clung to the old forms. Others began slowly to turn toward observation, toward the seeds of empirical thought. Medicine, especially, began to shift. Physicians had failed utterly to halt the pestilence with their bleedings, poultices, and astrological charts. In the aftermath, some began to question received wisdom. The idea grew that disease might spread not only by corrupted air, but by direct contagion. Though primitive by modern standards, this was a step toward a new understanding. Hospitals, too, evolved, becoming more oriented toward care rather than ritual. The Black Death had exposed ignorance, but in doing so, it opened the door to inquiry. The cultural imagination of religion also changed. Artwork showed not only saints in glory, but the raw suffering of Christ, the wounds of martyrs, the agony of purgatory. Faith became more visceral, more entwined with pain. Devotion was no longer only about heavenly triumph. It was about endurance in suffering, solidarity with the brokenness of the world. The plague had collapsed the distance between the sacred and the profane, reminding the faithful that holiness could be found in the midst of agony. Intellectually, the trauma bred a duality. On one side, deeper piety, on the other, sharper skepticism. Some became more devout than ever, crowding shrines, funding chantries, copying devotional books. Others turned away, doubting the efficacy of sacraments, mocking the futility of prayers unanswered. The unity of belief was fractured, replaced by a spectrum ranging from mystic intimacy to proto-reformist doubt. Even language reflected this transformation. English, long considered inferior to Latin and French, began to rise as a vehicle for serious thought. Chaucer's tales, Langland's allegories, Wycliffe's Bible, each gave dignity to the vernacular. In the wake of the plague, as communities rebuilt themselves, English emerged not just as the tongue of the people, but as a medium for theology, literature, and law. The catastrophe, by breaking continuity, had opened space for cultural renewal. By the turn of the 15th century, England was living in a different intellectual climate. The church remained powerful, but no longer unquestioned. Mysticism thrived, reform stirred, universities adapted, and the seeds of new science lay dormant but alive. The plague had been a fire that burned away old certainties, leaving ash, but also fertile soil. The legacy was paradoxical. The Black Death had shaken faith in priests, yet deepened personal devotion. It had discredited traditional medicine, yet encouraged inquiry. It had silenced scholars, yet seeded new voices. Out of grief and doubt emerged a faith more personal, an intellect more restless, and a culture less bound by the old chains of authority. The bells that had tolled for the dead now tolled for a new age of thought. England's religion and intellect had been scarred, but they had also been transformed. In the silence after the pestilence, voices rose. Mystics, reformers, poets, scholars, each grappling with the meaning of a world where death had seemed absolute, yet life, thought, and spirit endured. And yet, the changes in faith and thought were only part of a larger transformation, for the Black Death reshaped not just religion and intellect, but the very foundations of England itself. Summary of the overall impact. When the pestilence finally loosened its grip, England was no longer the kingdom it had been. The land was the same. The rolling fields, the rivers winding through valleys, the towers of stone churches, but the society inhabiting it had been remade. The Black Death was not merely a wave of sickness, it was an earthquake that shook the foundations of life, leaving aftershocks that would echo for centuries. Demographically, the kingdom had been hollowed. From 5 million souls, perhaps half were gone. Villages once full of laughter and toil stood empty. Parish registers ended abruptly, with whole families erased. The silence of abandoned hamlets and the loneliness of vast, untended fields bore witness to the scale of mortality. Economically, the old balance had collapsed. With labor scarce, wages rose, and peasants found leverage unknown to their ancestors. Lords turned from plow to pasture, feeding a wool trade that enriched merchants while displacing farmers. The statute of laborers tried to chain the world to the past, but necessity pushed relentlessly toward change. England became a society where bargaining replaced blind obedience, and opportunity crept into places it had never been before. Socially, the bonds of community were tested, broken, and reforged. Neighbors had abandoned each other in fear, yet brotherhoods and guilds rose to bind the survivors together. Women stepped into roles once closed. Children inherited lands. Families moved in search of better fortunes. The plague shattered rigidity and bred mobility, turning England into a more fluid and restless society. Politically, the crisis widened cracks in the old order. The commons gained influence as the crown begged for taxes. The nobility's ranks thinned, and peasants tested the boundaries of obedience. By 1381, rebellion flared, proof that authority could no longer rest on unquestioned tradition. The plague had not destroyed the monarchy, but it had reshaped the dialogue between ruler and ruled. Spiritually and intellectually, the pestilence shook faith, yet deepened devotion. Priests had died, monasteries had fallen silent, relics had failed to shield, but personal piety flourished. Mystics spoke of visions, reformers questioned clerical wealth, and scholars began to doubt the sufficiency of old philosophies. Out of despair came a search for new meaning, a turn toward both the inward life of the soul and the restless inquiry of the mind. In every sphere, demographic, economic, social, political, religious, the Black Death had been not only a destroyer, but also a creator. It stripped away certainties and revealed fragility, but it also opened doors to transformation. The England that emerged was scarred, haunted, but also changed, less bound by the chains of feudal order, more open to questioning, more conscious of the precariousness and preciousness of life. The bells that had tolled endlessly in 1349 continued to echo long after the graves were filled. They marked not only the deaths of millions, but the death of an old world. In its place rose a kingdom altered forever, a reminder that catastrophe, for all its horror, can also be the midwife of history. Yet the true measure of the Black Death was not only in the scars it left upon the 14th century, but in the legacy it carried forward, reshaping England's future as profoundly as its present. Legacy of the Black Death in English history. The Black Death did not vanish when its fever cooled and its graves were sealed. It lived on in the memory of England, shaping its history as surely as kings and conquests. To speak of the plague is to speak of a hinge in time, a dividing line between an old world and what would come after. Feudalism, already strained, never recovered its full grip. The scarcity of labor and the bargaining power of peasants accelerated the decline of serfdom, loosening chains that had bound generations to the soil. Over the following century, freedom spread, not by decree from monarchs, but by the slow erosion of obligations no longer enforceable. The peasant who once bent beneath his lord's command now walked with straighter back, knowing his service was sought, not assumed. Politically, the plague shifted the kingdom toward a more participatory order. The commons, rising in parliament, pressed for influence as taxation became a negotiation. Rebellions like that of 1381, though suppressed, revealed a new boldness among common people. Authority remained, but it was contested, its aura diminished by the knowledge that catastrophe could unmake hierarchy as swiftly as it unmade families. Culturally and intellectually, the memory of the plague lingered in art, in literature, in the very language of the people. The skeletal figure of death walked across church walls and manuscript margins, a reminder of equality in the grave. Writers like Chaucer and Langland gave voice to humor, satire, and lament in the tongue of the people, elevating English into a medium of thought and story. The trauma of the pestilence gave birth to creativity that would blossom in centuries to come. Spiritually, the church endured, but its authority was fractured. Mysticism and reform movements, nourished by the doubts and fervor of plague years, reshaped devotion. Faith became more personal, more questioning, more aware of human frailty. The silence of empty monasteries and the failure of relics to shield against death had left their mark, preparing the way for challenges that would one day culminate in reformation. Above all, the legacy of the Black Death lay in its lesson of impermanence. It taught that no structure, be it manor, monarchy, or monastery, was invincible. It revealed the fragility of life and the power of survival to transform societies. In its aftermath, England was smaller but more dynamic, poorer in lives but richer in possibility. The Black Death was not merely a disaster of the 14th century. It was a turning point in English history. It unmade an old order and cleared the ground for change. The echo of its bells resounded across generations, a solemn reminder that from even the darkest catastrophe, new worlds can be born.